It's been a journey. Today, just getting here was a journey. I had a corporate cab driver who had absolutely no idea where to go. So I have had a scenic tour of Christchurch, a scenic tour of your university, and I'm absolutely delighted to finally be here in front of you, talking to actually what is friends and more importantly, family. I actually have one of my daughter's very best friend in the audience. So when you've come a long way and you've been on the road for 3 weeks and you're talking about your book, it's kind of wonderful to rock up somewhere where you didn't think you'd know anybody and find somebody that you've shared a big chunk of your life with. So thank you for being in the audience today, Anna. It's lovely to see you. But this today is about another journey, and the journey I want to take you on is my journey as an entrepreneur. As Paige alluded, I started very young. When I was 10, my family had chickens. Problem was there were 4 of us and 8 chickens. Now I saw that problem as an opportunity. There were 4 spare eggs. My brother, who's not an entrepreneur, saw it as no opportunity at all and walked straight past the 4 spare eggs. But every day those 4 eggs annoyed me, and I thought, what can I do with those and how can I turn them into something? Making a pavlova was probably a little bit bigger than me at that stage, so I decided to sell the eggs. To do that, I needed packaging. So I went and saw the neighbours, asked the mothers of the houses for their spare egg cartons, filled them with my eggs, and then resold the eggs back to the mothers in their own packaging. So it was quite a good start and an entrepreneurial start for a 10-year-old. When I was 13, I started babysitting. And that was great, but babysitting's a really interesting thing. It's like something I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, which is called selling time. With babysitting, all you had to do was sell time. So I could only be at one house looking after one group of children at a time. So I went to the girls I went to school with and said, if you pay me $5, I'll give you a babysitting referral. So before long, I had a babysitting circle with 10 other girls paying me $5 a night so that I would give them babysitting referrals. So when I look back, I think my selling eggs was my first FMCG business, fast moving consumer goods, and my selling babysitting time was my first recruitment company. I was selling human capital. But of course, when you're 13, you don't know that. And I didn't know what an entrepreneur was. And if somebody had told me that I'd find myself on the world stage in Monte Carlo being judged as an entrepreneur, or even better still, judging the world's best entrepreneurs, I would have thought they were crazy. But it happened. And it happened because of a whole pile of circumstances. One is that because I have inside me what I consider to be the entrepreneurial gene. Now, I don't know where it came from because I'm adopted, and certainly my adoptive family are not entrepreneurs. My mother was a telephonist and my father was an engineer. So it wasn't nature, it wasn't nurture, so I have to say it must have been nature. But because I have only ever met my birth mother once, and she told me who my birth father was, but I have no relationship with either of them, I can't tell you where it came from. But it was there and it was buried deep. And all my life, I've always looked at opportunities. I've never thought, I can't do it. I've thought, how can I do it? And most people like to say, well, you would never have been able to do it if you hadn't met your husband, Bill Foreman. And I completely agree that Bill gave me an arena. Bill gave me the most amazing opportunity that most young people could never believe possible. And that was, he gave me the opportunity to run his business against all odds. Because when we met, he was a very, very successful corporate chairman. He ran a company called Trigon. He had about 650 staff. He was growing from a tin shed in Hamilton, where he had started 10 years earlier, to what became the Trigon Packaging Systems Company. And when we sold it 24 years ago, he had 1,000 employees. We had factories, 2 in New Zealand, 2 in Cambridge, 1 in Cambridge in the United Kingdom, 1 in Telford in the United Kingdom, 1 in Seattle and 1 in Atlanta. And that's a pretty huge achievement when you put it in the scope of the time. We're talking about early 80s. There was no email, there weren't any tablets, the internet didn't exist. If Bill wanted to talk to somebody or interact with one of his team members, he actually had to either phone them or get on a plane and go and see them. And he did that. And he did it because he believed that he had the world's best packaging products. And hey, they weren't fancy. He made plastic bags. Now, plastic bags is not something you would think would make you a multimillionaire, but they did. And why his plastic bags made him spectacularly successful and taught me how to be spectacularly successful sometimes, because I actually wanted to call my book Mistakes, I've Made a Few, but Random House said nobody would ever buy a book based on someone's mistakes, so we decided In the Arena was more positive. But going back to Bill, he had a huge belief that he could sell his plastic bags anywhere, and that with the right research and development, his plastic bags could become anything. And an example of this is that we were making our happy plastic bags, which, let's face it, they're rubbish bags, they're courier bags, they're bags, but they're nothing flash. And all of a sudden, he was in Seattle having a meeting, and he was having a meeting with somebody who had done some work for the Bank of America. The Bank of America said, we have a problem. We can't package money. And the way we do it at the moment is we put our notes folded up in a plastic bag inside a canvas bag, and we put them in a courier truck, and we send them from bank to bank. Well, Bill came up with a system that just involved plastic bags. His system was, and I'm sorry, I've missed out the most important part. When they were moving the bags of money from bank to bank, money was going missing, because the courier drivers would sit in the back of their vans and they would randomly take a $100 note from this bundle and a $100 note from that bundle. But because it was random, they could never work out how the bags were tampered with, who tampered with them, and where they were tampered with on the journey. So they presented this to Bill as their problem. And this plastic bag manufacturer from New Zealand came up with the solution. And that was, he developed what he called Tamper-Evident Banking, so that when the money was put in the plastic bag, it was sealed shut. If the seal was broken, colour would immediately come all over the money and all over the bags. So immediately you would know that that bag had been tampered with. Better still, the colour changed with time, so you would also know if it was 2 hours it would be purple, if it was 3 hours it would be green. So you would also know what time on the journey someone had tried to tamper with the bags. And that one invention, for somebody who started off making plastic bags, earned him a $50 million contract with the Bank of America. And you know, when you think back, $50 million was a huge contract to have in 1988. But he did it because he believed in R&D, he believed in export. You know, who in those days would think that if you made plastic bags in New Zealand, you could start plastic bag factories all over the world? Well, he did. And I think what he basically taught other people, and I believe he is actually one of New Zealand's unsung heroes, because people actually don't know about him. I go around talking and I feel really proud just to tell his story. But what he did was he changed the way people saw plastic bags. Instead of seeing a plastic bag, they saw it as a packaging system. And so he became a packaging systems guru. And along the way, he learnt some lessons. And he decided that I would be his apprentice. Now, it's not celebrity apprentice, but it was a bit like that, because everyone wanted to vote me off. Nobody wanted me in that job. When he went to his board and he said, I've decided to appoint my wife a director because she needs to know how to run this business. You know, I'm older than she is, quite possibly I will die, and she's going to need you directors, your help, but she's going to actually need to know what we've got. What do we own? More importantly, what is she going to have to sell? Well, not one of those directors wanted me. In fact, every one of them told him that they couldn't do it, and they couldn't have me, and that he was making a terrible mistake, and he didn't need an apprentice. And in fact, one gentleman, and I'll put that reservedly, said very clearly that a woman's place was in the bedroom, not the boardroom. So I was invited along knowing that I was not going to be the flavour of the month. But I didn't know how bad it was going to be till I arrived at my first board meeting. And I had said to Bill, you know, what do you do in a board meeting? You know, I had no experience. I left school at 15. Yes, I had an entrepreneurial flair. Yes, I had the gene. But to go from being a mum at home with children who's got the entrepreneurial flair and sold a few eggs, to being at the boardroom of one of New Zealand's biggest private companies, even if the chairman believes in you, And even if he loves you and tells you you're fantastic, it's still pretty scary to walk into that room. So I said, what do I do when I walk in? And Bill's a very typical Kiwi bloke. And he said, oh, it's really simple. You put your paw out. And so I always remember that. And on the way, driving down, I kept thinking, the paw goes out, the paw goes out. And I got into the boardroom and I put my paw out and not one of those men would shake it. They all dropped their hands and looked at me. So, you know, there was no welcome. There was no, let's teach you. All there was, what on earth has he done? And, you know, the first few months were really tough because although I knew more than they thought, and the reason that I knew more than they thought was because Bill was messy. Now, hard to describe this, but he, in the days before we got all our information, as we do today, on a pilot, on a pad, or on your iPhone, or any of those things, all Bill's information came through on a fax. And so he would get information from all his businesses all over the world every day, but he was messy and he'd leave piles, what he would call muck messes, all over the house. And because I liked to read, when I was supposedly cleaning and vacuuming and being a good wife, I was actually sitting cross-legged on the floor reading. So I'd read his muck messes, I'd read the faxes, and I knew a little bit about his business, which of course these men gave me no credit for. So that when I actually did say something, and I'd been told specifically by Bill to say nothing for 3 months, but when I did say something, it made a lot more sense than they thought it would, because I'd actually had years of learning about them and their business by reading someone else's rubbish. So, you know, I say Trigon is a good example of how entrepreneurs can turn rubbish into success, because Bill turned packaging rubbish, literally Trigon rubbish bags, into a business that we sold 24 years ago for 130 million. And I turned his rubbish on the floor into knowledge, which I've gone to take on to my other businesses. So it's a little bit about the Trigon story, but I've always felt that I was, and I don't know how many of you have felt this, but that there was a piece of glass between me and the other cool kids, and that I was always the not cool kid looking in at the other people that were doing it right. And Bill was really aware of this, and it was made worse because people would say, oh, Diane did quite a good job at Trigon, but you know, she'd never have done it if you hadn't handed it to her. Or other people would say, you know, Bill, she's all right, but she could never have done it on her own. And so he said to me one day, you need to do this for you. You need your own business, and you need to prove that you're good enough without me there, as he said, getting in the way. But I mean, he never got in the way, because I was so lucky that with him I had a mentor. And that's something that I would say to anybody who's aspiring to be an entrepreneur. You need a mentor. I say coming up with the business is like getting pregnant and housing a baby. But to actually give birth to that baby, you need a mentor who's like a midwife, someone who's going to be with you through the tough times and the hard times and the really good times. Someone that you can ring. Just as one of my mentees rang me while I was going round and round Canterbury University, she rang me today to tell me that she had just beaten her budget. And she said, I've told my staff that we've beaten budget and no one cares. I'm ringing you because I know you'll care. And that's what a mentor is. It's the person that keeps your stardust bag filled. When no one else seems to be there, no one else wants to care. So with Bill, I had a mentor, and to be frank, I had capital. Because that's another criticism people like to make of me. Oh, well, she'd never have done as well if she hadn't had the money from Trigon. I put my hand up and say that's absolutely true. To be successful, you need mentoring, you need capital, and you need an idea. And for that, I am very grateful to Bill and to Trigon. But what I've done and what I'm proud of is that I managed to stay in the arena. I managed to keep doing the job, and I'm still doing the job 20 years later. And I believe that the reason that I've been able to do that is everything I learnt from him. And I've taken it into new businesses. And I've written the book because not everybody has unrestricted access to one of the best entrepreneurs of their generation. But by putting it into a book, I don't know if my ideas will help you or hinder you, but at least you can read it and you can think, ah, that's how she grew an international market. Oh, that's what she looks at when she's exporting. Or, more importantly, that's how she chooses people. Because the overall learning for me, from what Bill taught me and from what I've learned in Emerald Group, and just to give you a little sidebar on Emerald Group, it has been a collection of businesses. We've been into all sorts of things. We had furniture manufacturing in the United States with a group of retail shops. Not one of my most successful happenings, but we did it and it didn't work. We've also had retirement villages. Again, not something I would say was particularly successfully well done, but we came out of it with our shirt. But the things that have worked are really so exciting that when you get the opportunity to see something flourishing and growing, you want to talk about it and you want to shout about it. And the things that I've found that have worked for me is, first of all, when I've had the best mentors, but most importantly, when I've had the best people. Because a business is only a collection of people. But when you bring the right people together with the right idea, the right leadership, you actually have a form of alchemy. It's really exciting. And that's what entrepreneurs get to do every day. It's like making a great big cake. You get to put in the very, very best ingredients. You stir it around with a bit of your knowledge, and ultimately you get to have a cake to sell. And that's one of the things that I like to talk to young people about particularly. In a business like mine, I am growing a business that's selling a product. So I get to sell my product, and if I'm really good, I get to sell my business, as I've just done with Emerald Foods. Now, Emerald Foods was an ice cream company. I bought it as a distressed sale from Nestlé in Switzerland. They couldn't make it work in New Zealand. They built the biggest, shiniest ice cream plant. They hired some very good people, and they had very direct access to milk, basic ingredient for ice cream. And they said they were doing it to serve the Asian market. One big mistake. They didn't put any sales force in Asia. So whether Movenpick, in their genius sitting in Switzerland, thought that the Asian market were just going to pop orders through the letterbox, I don't know. But I do know why they failed. And that was a simple mistake. They got everything right, but they didn't get right how they were going to get the sales. So they offered it to me. I bought it. When we bought it, it's probably 50 staff, and it was going, only way you could describe it was going south quickly. What I needed was a brand, because in the deal that I struck with them, they said you can have the Movenpick brand, but only for a year. So I knew that it's all very well buying a cheap ice cream plant, but it would turn out to be a very expensive ice cream plant if I couldn't get my own brand, because I'm a huge believer in brand. You are your brand. You've got to believe in it, you've got to invest in it, you've got to be able to talk about it, you've got to be able to pitch it, but you've got to love it. And it's got to be an authentic representation of you. So my brand that I desperately wanted was New Zealand Natural. I knew about the product, I'd seen it overseas, but how do I get my hands on it? Because it's all very well having the factory, but without the brand, I didn't have much. I was in the same position as Nestlé. So I put on what I call my big girl pants, and I went off to Australia, because the brand New Zealand Natural was owned by South Africans out of Sydney, contracting their ice cream manufacturer to whomever. So here was probably what was one of New Zealand's great food brands, not even owned by New Zealanders, and certainly the brand wasn't being exploited to the full benefit of New Zealand. So I went hunting, and it's a bit like a relationship, because I had to buy that brand from 5 men that didn't want to sell it. So there were good days, and we had happy dates, and we had some very unhappy dates, where sometimes they would say, yes, we'll sell it, but I want. And the number was so huge, I couldn't even put it into my calculator. And so then I'd pull away, and then they'd contact me, or one would contact me and say, oh, I've just had a falling out with my friend, I'm over it, you can buy my shares. And there were no preemptive rights. Now, I'm not sure if you understand preemptive rights, but what it normally means is that if someone wants to sell their shares, they have to be offered to the other shareholders. I think one of the reasons I got the New Zealand Natural brand was there weren't preemptive rights, which meant that each shareholder could treat individually. So they'd have a fight, and I'd pick up one shareholder's piece of the action. And then, of course, they'd be really angry, so they'd have another fight that half of it had gone. And so, there's Diane, I'm here. And eventually I got to the stage where I owned half the business. And so I got to sit around their board table. But of course, they weren't all that pleased about having me, having bought out a couple of their mates, sitting around their board table. So it wasn't the happiest of places. But eventually, the other shareholders decided that they would get rid of their business, that I wanted to take it somewhere they didn't. And so they sold it to me. So I ended up then having a failed ice cream factory from Nestle and a failing ice cream brand from Australia owned by some South Africans. So you've got to get some synergy in all of this. So I bought the New Zealand natural brand home to New Zealand. My failing ice cream factory became successful because I got some great people. I took my Trigon lesson and I looked at the management team and I realised it wasn't just Nestle's fault. It was the fault of the team. They weren't engaged, they weren't going the same way, and they weren't the best people money could hire. So I went out and I found a CEO who was outstanding. And what made him special was that he had an MBA, he was a food technologist, and for many years he had worked at Kapiti. So he knew the ice cream business inside and out. He was young, he was, this was 10 years ago, he would tell you now he's very old and grey. But in those days he was young and keen, and I headhunted him out of Gisborne, where he was working in a seed factory, not FMCG or ice cream, and I brought him to Auckland. And we together changed our business. And how we changed it was we only wanted people that were better than us. And that's what I tell people. Only hire people that are better than you. In senior roles, you can do what you can do, but you can only be awesome if somebody else is in there being better than you. Because at the end of the day, business is like tennis. You only get better at it if you're playing with people that are better. So when we hire people, first question we ask is, can they do this job better than me? We're very careful before we put new people on. We appraise. We totally live and die by psychometric appraising, and no one gets a senior role with me that hasn't been appraised. Hiring people is hard enough. You want to take as much of the guesswork out of it as you can. So we appraised our people, and we did something that's got me a lot of media attention, and I thought it was just normal. We did drive-bys. So if someone wants to work for us in a senior job, we actually drive past their house, because I figure how they look after their biggest asset is how they're going to look after mine. So if they're going to want $150,000 or $300,000 a year to work for me, and I drive past their house and they're living in a tip, it's going to tell me a couple of things. One, they haven't got much self-pride, and I always tell people, remember, how much you value yourself is how much other people are going to value you. So if you don't value yourself enough to mow your lawns, not have old bombs, you're not going to become a very successful employee. So I really think the drive-by is important. The other thing we do before we hire is we get 4 references, because New Zealand's got some really weird employment law, which is a kind of way of saying I find it difficult to work in New Zealand and why I often work overseas. And what we tend to do to get rid of people is we do deals with them and we offer them good references. So that's what makes a written reference useless. So I never look at a written reference. I want 4 others. I want a referee from somebody that I'll take someone that they've worked for, but not their most recent employer, someone they've worked for in the past. I also want a reference from someone they know socially, someone who can say, yep, I go to the rugby with John and he's a great guy, and can tell me about the person. The other thing I always do is ask for a reference from somebody who's been a supplier to the person. And I don't care if it's just someone that's sold them photocopier paper. Because again, how someone treats people when they're in a superior relationship is how they're going to treat your staff. So I always want to talk to that person who's had that kind of relationship with them. And the final person I want to talk to is someone they've actually employed. So we call it the square. So we try and cover each corner. And then before we give someone a job, after we've driven by, after we've checked their references, after they've had an appraisal, the final thing we do is I take them out for dinner. Because, you know, it's really important to know what you're getting in a package. And I take them and their partner, because often that's really telling. You know, I'm an export business. My people are on the road. Excuse me for talking in current tense, because it's only recently that I sold. So actually, at the moment, I'm unemployed and unemployable. But I'll speak as though I was an export business. I was an export business. These people are on the road a lot of days. If you take their partner out for dinner and the partner says, oh, I just don't know how I ever cope. I've got 5 children and my husband's always late home from work and I just can't cope with getting the children bathed. You know, and I've had that happen. And you think, okay, well, this isn't going to work because I want him in London next week. If he's got 5 children and a wife that's not coping, this is going to be a disaster. So I think it's really important to get to know the partner, and also so I can tell the partner what I expect, so that I sit there and say, you know, this might be a great job and it might have great bonuses and huge potential, but at the end of the day, your husband's going to be on the road for me 100 days a year. Can you cope? And you know, and I've had people come back to me after those sort of dinners and say, we discussed it as a family, it's not going to work. And I think it's really important to have a good business to start off as you mean to go on, with really great communication, so that when people finally come and work for you, I've hired really, really slowly. They've had time to appraise me, assess the people that work for me. They've been exposed to many aspects of my business, and they can decide if I'm good enough for them. Because, you know, at the end of a day, an employment relationship is a two-way relationship. It's never just one. And that person's only going to be a success in my organisation if they like me, my product, my brand, and what we as an organisation stand for. And I like to tell people all the way through the process, this isn't one-sided. You guys have got to get to know me as well as I'm getting to know you. And please feel free to delete me at any point, because I'll certainly delete you before I get to the final point too. So we're honest with each other. And I think honesty is really important. Of course, the next thing is, what if it all goes wrong? And that's why my mantra is hire slowly, but fire very, very fast. Because if you get the wrong people in your organisation, you've got the wrong organisation. So what I say to people is, if it's clear that it's not going to work, you know, it's not the employee that's made a mistake, it's me. Because I've judged them that they should be here. I've put them in a role that they clearly can't do. So if the world was perfect and New Zealand employment law was different, what I would do would be sit down with them and say, this isn't working for you or me, let's get a really quick exit. And I pay people to go away. And I've done that many times, and I think it's the very best thing, because they retain their dignity and they can go out and say to their friends, actually it didn't work, but I've got 3 or 6 months to find a new job. My other people don't get bogged down by going, God, she's got it wrong again and I'm stuck with this guy and they're useless and they're never going to go, and we have to engineer a situation to get rid of people. That's not dignity. And I think that the most dignified way is to have a conversation, and I view paying compensation to people that the employment relationship hasn't worked as a fine, and it's a fine on me for getting it wrong. And I think people should be able to do that with dignity. And in a lot of our businesses, we've been able to do that and have those conversations. But of course, with some people, you have to be very cognizant of the rules of employment, and that's not how it works. And I don't think it's dignified to be going around giving people first, second, third warnings and saying to them, oh, just watch, wait, you know, saying to your other people, oh, let me know when they do something wrong and we'll be all over them with a written warning. Let me know if that doesn't work. Yeah, let's get rid of them. That's not dignified. It's not dignified for them, and it's not ethical for us. But our employment law kind of forces us into doing that. And I would love to see a much more open and a much more engaging situation where we just keep talking. Because unless we get the best people, we're not going to have the best businesses. One of the other things that I think is incredibly important about growing good people is incentivising them. We incentivise at every level of our organisation. So if you're in an ice cream store and say it's Monday, my people will look, the managers will look on a Monday morning and they'll go, oh, it's not going to be much of a day today, it's raining. Now in ice cream, rain is diabolical. Cold's fine, but if it rains, nobody buys an ice cream. So the managers will set a daily target. and I'm picking a number out of the sky, but for the ease, let's say $10,000. That's a lot of ice cream, by the way. But say they pick the $10,000 target. First thing they do is communicate. So when the staff walk in, they go, right, today's target is $10,000. All during the day, the staff are being updated on what the target is. You know, we're 8,300, we're 9,200. And they're told that if they get their target, they'll be given a cash bonus incentive on that day, because they're not going to be working for me in Q4 in 6 months' time when and if we get our KPIs. None of that language matters to them. What matters to them is if I do my job today, I'm going to get a bonus. So the closer the person is to the coalface, the closer the bonus has to be. So we incentivise on a daily basis. So we say to them, okay, it's 5 minutes to 6, we're 9,900 or we're 9,800. You will never see chocolate sauce, double scoops of ice cream and whipped cream being sold so fast, because there is something in it for them. There's an immediate incentive. So to have a good business, I think you've got to really incentivise people. The other thing that we did, which was a little bit different with people, is we have things called happy hundies. And a happy hundy, and my tax people down here are getting a nervous breakdown and they're starting to shake at this, because I know every time I talk at EY about it, they get really worried. But happy hundy is Diane Foreman goes to the bank out of her personal bank account, which I know is against the law, and I'll take $1,000 out of my bank. I'll put 500 in my CEO's hand and I'll keep 500 in mine. And we use those happy hundies to motivate and incentivate people when we see them doing something right. Because too often as an employer, you're telling people when they're doing something wrong. You're saying, you didn't do that well, you should have done that differently. What we do is we try and catch people doing it right. And when we do, we go up to them and go, Noah, today is your happy hundy day. That was fantastic. And they walk home with an extra $100. Now, if your take-home pay is $300 or $400 a week, to go home with $100 is huge. And I can tell you, it totally changes behaviour. An example I'll give is that I don't know about anybody else, but I think I'm the only person that cleans up rubbish in my own car parks. So I go to my factories and there's pie packets, there's beer, there's God knows what, people's cigarette butts. I always wonder why it's only me that knew how to pick it up. And no matter how many times I would say to the others, clean the car park, it's our brand, it's what we are, clean it. Yeah, right. And then I spotted Noah one day picking rubbish up. I went up to Noah, Noah, here's your happy hundy, that's amazing. Do you know that I have never yet been to any of my factories and found a dirty car park? Because the word spread like wildfire, there's a happy hundy in it. And of course, nobody knows when you're going to turn up. So I think it's a really good example of showing that if you catch people doing something right and celebrate, you're going to change behaviours. If you wait until they're doing something wrong and try and teach them, oh, you did that wrong, you should do it this way, it's negative, it closes off. And what we hope to do is by teaching people to think that there's something in it. I'm not a great believer that it's all about the corner office or the culture. Culture's great, it's important. But for most people, it's about what I'm taking home today, tomorrow, next week. And so to get people on your team, I incentivise really close to the action. Another thing that we do is, because culture is important, we turn it a bit on its head. And at Christmas time, we have trestle tables in the car park. We cook lunch, but we being myself and the senior team, we cook lunch for our staff, and they bring their families, and we serve them, and we make it a really big special occasion. And then during the year, we ask them to nominate who they think are the special people. And so there's a staff vote, and at the end of the lunch, we present, it could be a trip to Fiji, it could be, in one case, we knew that this person needed new tyres for their car. So we say, you factory staff have nominated Joe Brown. Joe Brown, here you are. You have been an outstanding person this year. Here's something that you need for you. And so again, we're trying to get people involved with us and thinking differently about the business. And it's about bringing those people on this personal journey that we call our business. Because, it's not mine, even though it's a private company, it's actually ours. It's ours are all the people that come on the journey. So that's a little bit about how we think about our people, a little bit about how I believe appraisals are incredibly important. The last thing that I'll leave you with is talking about brand. And brand, as I said, New Zealand Natural, an amazing brand. But I'll end probably on a negative about telling you about a story when I got a brand that I wasn't authentic with. And that's my husband went out and bought a business called Loaded Hog and One Red Dog. Now these were bars in Auckland in the height of the America's Cup Challenge. And I was very sick, and he came home and he said, guess what? What? I bought the hog. I said, why would you buy the hog? He said, I've always wanted a business where people queue up to buy from. And I said, well, what am I going to do with it? And he said, well, that's your problem. I've bought it. He said, I think it's going to be fantastic. We could have hogs all over the world. And that was absolutely a true story. I had no idea he was even looking to buy the hogs. Anyway, I got better, and I was back at work, and I thought, how on earth am I going to run the Loaded Hog bars? Because I'm a teetotaler. And that made it really difficult, because I'd go to a meeting, and at the meeting, they'd be talking about how we could push more alcohol down people's throats. How can you do that if you don't understand it, if you're not an authentic representation of your brand? So I decided that what I needed was a mentor, and I needed a really big, heavy hitter mentor. And the only person that I'd ever heard about who was an expert on booze was someone called Douglas Myers. And he was the CEO and chairman of New Zealand's biggest brewery. Now it's pretty scary when you're 5'0", you're not very well known, you didn't go to King's where he did, you didn't play golf where he did. How do you go about bringing a heavy hitter like Douglas? So I rang his PA, thinking she'd tell me to get out of her sight, and she said, oh, Douglas will see you tomorrow. So I came and saw this beer baron, and I explained everything and remember, he was a competitor, and I explained everything that I'd done wrong and why it wasn't working, and he looked at me and he said, it's so simple. You are not an authentic representation of your brand. You will never be a success in the booze business. You need to get out fast. And I said, well, how will I do that? So he went through my business plan and he critiqued it. That won't work, this will work, try that. And he said, but what you need to do is find a purchaser. Here's a list of people you should approach. And with his advice, and remember, why would he? I mean, he was helping a competitor, but he did it because he was generous. I think he thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever met, that this young woman was standing there, I was young in those days, telling him that I didn't drink. He said, you don't drink? What? Not even wine? No. Not even champagne? Are you mad? So I think I kind of piqued his interest. But at the end of the day, I took his advice, I took his mentoring, I sold the business 4 months later and I made $1 million profit. And I think the story there is all about get a great mentor, go to the top, be an authentic representation of your brand, and if you get it wrong, get someone to help you get out quickly, because the longer it stays, the harder it is. So that's kind of me.